Again, welcome to our North Canton congregation of the United Church of God. And well, technically, we're in North Canton, the North Canton area doing it, this Bible study, but it is actually a Bible study for our four congregations, North Canton and Youngstown, Ohio, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Wheeling, West Virginia. So we have brethren in all those areas. Hello to all of you. And then we have some who find out about it, and like many of the rest of you, and like to join us, and we're happy for that, so you're mighty welcome to be here. Before we start, I want to go ahead and ask God's inspiration and blessing as we're entering the Sabbath here and getting ready to study His Word. Heavenly Father, we just pause before you, before we get started with this Bible study, very interesting study, a detailed study in many ways, but it shows the intricate work that you do among the sons of men. And certainly the work that you do among your brethren in your church over the centuries and centuries since the time of Jesus Christ. So we pray for your direction and guidance in our understanding of the subject tonight, and pray for an open mind to understand your word better. And not only that, but a mind that retains what we learn. So we do need that very much as well. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for your holy Sabbath that we are now enjoying. We give you the praise and glory and ask all of this in Jesus Christ's name. Amen. Okay, well, I'm Randy Stiver. I'm the pastor here in the area. And if you were tuned in for our recent Sabbath Bible study, we got snowed out last week in 3 of the 4 congregations, but we had actually canceled in all 4 because of the winter storm warning. And in place of a Bible study, or rather a Sabbath service, what I did was began a Bible study on a topic about the book of Daniel. Specifically Daniel chapter 11, and we went through basically the introduction to it, which is chapter 10, and got just a little ways into chapter 11, not very far, about a verse into it. We're going to pick up where we left off last Sabbath, for those who are local here and we're watching that, and then we're going to wade on through chapter 11. Now, if you haven't read chapter 11 of Daniel for a while, let me remind you that it is one of the most detailed prophecies in the Scriptures. Very detailed. But it is also because of that detail, prophetic detail that Daniel gave during the time of the Medo-Persian Empire. The Persians went on to exist for a couple of hundred years after Daniel, or nearly so, before Alexander the Great came and conquered them. And then Alexander the Great went on to establish a gigantic empire, and as soon as he had finished conquering it all, he died, and left no heir that was old enough to take rule in his place. So his 4 generals basically broke the empire into pieces, and they fought about that for a while. It had to be a knockdown drag out, because for the Greeks to be able at that time to have the organizational power and the fighting prowess to conquer a huge swath of Europe all the way across to the borders of India, all the Middle East, where Persia was, where Babylonia was, the remnants of Assyria, all those areas were conquered by them. For them then to fight amongst themselves, it had to be a fearsome thing. But they continued to do that for a long time, which is one of the reasons why then Rome got the leg up and became a much greater empire in that sense than even Greece had ever been, because it broke into the 4 pieces. So we're going to pick up Daniel chapter 11, and we'll go right to chapter 11, and we want to look in verse 1. Let me read that over here. Also in the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood up to confirm and strengthen him. And so that's what Daniel did. Darius the Mede was not an emperor of the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire had conquered Babylon, and Daniel had been an advisor to King Nebuchadnezzar. The king of underneath the emperor was Cyrus. But one of the kings, the regional kings under him, was Darius. This is not Darius the Great of later fame, about 500 AD of the Persians. This was just Darius, was of the Medo-Persian Empire. Initially it was the Medo-Persian, the Medes and the Persians together. Later on the Persians dominated it. It simply was called the Persian Empire. So Daniel was back then, and so this is much later. This is actually, within speaking of a time after the Persian Empire has completely been conquered by Alexander along with everybody else in their wake. So it's significant time has passed. In Daniel 11 and verse 2 it says this, "And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings will arise in Persia." And now Daniel is giving this detailed prophecy. "The 4th shall be richer than them all, and by his strength and through his riches he shall stir up against the realm of Greece." So there were emperors of Persia. Darius the Mede, of course, was under Cyrus. So Cyrus was the emperor, and Darius, who Daniel dealt with, the lion's den and all that sort of thing, he worked with the emperor as one of his subordinates. After Cyrus then came Cambyses from 530 to 522. Then Gomada, I guess is how it's pronounced, about 522. He was kind of an interloper emperor that tried to pull off a coup d'etat that didn't work very long. A few months is all, because Darius I, there ended up being, I think, 5 or 6 Dariuses in the course of the time of Persia. But Darius I was from 522 to 486 BC, counting down, remember, we're in before Christ. And then ultimately Xerxes and Artaxerxes, and it was one of the Xerxes emperors that Esther was married to. But ultimately in verse 3, "Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will." So we shift the scene to Greece. The mighty king was going to be Alexander the Great, because this is Daniel prophesying a long time before Alexander came about. And very much like Isaiah prophesying about Cyrus. When you go to Isaiah 45, you'll see, chapter 45, you'll find Cyrus is named by name as an emperor that would rise and would free the people of Judah to come back and resettle in Jerusalem, which he did. When he took over from the Babylonians, he opened the door for the Jews to go back. And many of them did, not all of them, but enough of them did to establish a population back in their homeland. So God had Isaiah prophesy of Cyrus, and that's a real fascinating study. Maybe we'll put that down for a Bible study sometime. Now we have Daniel, who is a prophet, same as Isaiah, except that he's a prophet out of country. Because he had been taken in one of the early waves of captivity into Babylonian captivity, and then he served the Persians. After he served the emperors of Babylon, he would then serve the Persian emperor by serving his regional king underneath the emperor Darius. "But a mighty king will arise, who will rule with great dominion," in verse 3, "and do according to his will." Now, the mighty king, when you look down through the time of Persia, you have various levels of might, but as most empires do, as the longer they go, the slacker they get on the way they manage. The zeal of a new empire sort of slackens. This is the way human nature. So we shift to Greece, because the new king, the mighty king, is Alexander the Great. He comes. He conquers all across Asia Minor and the Middle East, including Judea, although they mostly came peaceably to Alexander. That's another story we touched on last time, but we'll probably cover another time in a Bible study. And then he began to move out across toward Persia. And he conquered the main Persian capitals, and he swept all the way to India, Alexander did. They called the Nazi army, used a battle term called blitzkrieg. Lightning war is what that means. Krieg is war, and blitz, I guess, is lightning. A blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Alexander had lightning war down pat long before them. And he seemed to be able to reach further, go faster and reach further than the German nation ever did in World War II. So, he was the son of Philip of Macedonia. So technically he wasn't Greek. He was a Macedonian Greek. Macedonia is a country, even today, that is right on the northern edge of Greece. And it was then, too. He planned a great war against Persia after he and his father had conquered everything within, a reasonable traveling distance around where they were. All of Greece, Asia Minor, or the eastern side, western side of Asia Minor. But he wanted to go and get Persia, so that's where Alexander went. He defeated a Persian army at the Battle of Issus in 333 BC, the first Persian army. That was in Western Asia Minor, or Eastern Asia Minor. And then he conquered Tyre, which was right next door to the ancient nation of Israel. Tyre and Sidon were the Phoenician cities. He conquered that, assumed command of Judea, and conquered Egypt. So he swept all the way down across the Levant. The Levant is a French term for that sort of crescent of the eastern sea coast of the Mediterranean, starting up in the bottom of Turkey and coming down straight down south and then curling back toward Egypt. He conquered all of that quite rapidly. Once he had conquered Egypt, he wasn't done. He wanted to conquer all the way to India, which is what he eventually did. He came back 2 years later after he conquered Egypt, got done with that. Then he came back to finish off the Persians in the Battle of Arbela in 331 BC, 2 years after he had conquered their first army. And then, as I said, blitzkrieged his way across Persia into India. Vast empire. And the legends say that at the end of that he was disappointed because there weren't any more empires to conquer. He died, however, very, very early. He died in 323. The first army of the Persians that he conquered was in 333. 10 years later, he was dead. The empire then was divided in the gap of power, divided among the four generals. The major generals were Ptolemy Soter, Ptolemy family, Ptolmey, but Soter was his, I presume, the throne name. He received Egypt, Judea, that would be nation of Israel as we know it today, and part of Syria, southern Syria. So it was that section down and then all of Egypt. Seleucus, 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 also called Nicator, had northern Syria, Babylonia, and the territory east to India. That's quite a large sweep, that last part that Alexander had conquered. Those were the two major generals. The other two lesser generals, as far as their ability in this general battle that took place, Lysimachus ended up with Asia Minor, basically Turkey, what is today Turkey. Cassander was the last of the four. He ended up with Greece and Macedonia. Now, initially, that's what they had, and then their borders shifted as they fought back and forth with them. The first two, Ptolemy and Seleucus, grew powerful. Ultimately, Seleucus Nicator, that would be the one who ruled out of Syria, out of northern Syria, he became known as the king of the north. And Ptolemy Soter, the Ptolemy, Ptolemy, became known as the king of the south, ruling out of Egypt. Now, we get into the detailed prophecy that unfolds in the rest of this chapter. We'll have to go through it fairly swiftly. I'd like to hopefully get done with it in this Bible study. So we read in verse 5, also the king of the south shall become strong. Okay, that's the Ptolemaic kingdom down in Egypt. They shall become strong, as well as one of his princes, and he shall gain power over him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. So Ptolemy, the Ptolemaic kingdom, is going to have power over the northern kingdom to a certain degree, over the Seleucid kingdom. That happened in 312 BC. Seleucus Nicator, a general of Ptolemy of Egypt, gained power over the kingship of Syria when Ptolemy was busy elsewhere. So one of his princes, he says, the king of the south shall become strong, as well as one of his princes. And the prince became strong because he ended up getting the throne as the king of the north, while his boss was still the king of the south. That happened in 312 BC. At the end of verse 6, now we go on. The Holy Land, by the way, was caught in a tug of war here because Judea, as was referred to at that time, the nation of Israel, the boundary of the traditional Holy Promised Land. It was caught in a tug-of-war back and forth between the Ptolemies of Egypt and the Seleucids of Syria. Back and forth it went. So that kind of war on the Jews. Sometimes they could make money on that. Remember, it was the Jews, and the Jews are not all the 12 tribes of Israel. They are primarily the tribe of Judah, which was a very large tribe, and the tribe of Benjamin, which was a small tribe, but not uncapable by any means. And the third section was a significant percentage, maybe half, of the Levites, the tribe of Levi, because the priesthood stayed where the temple was, or stayed where the temple had been. And thus you had the Levites and the Jews of Judah, the Jews who were now all technically Levites, and the Jews who were technically Benjamites. They were all together lumped in as Jews. So the king of the south became strong, and as well as one of his princes, that prince gained the northern kingdom by subterfuge and power. In verse 6. Verse 6, and at the end of some years they shall join forces, for the daughter of the king of the south shall go to the king of the north to make an agreement. So they were, sort of as a face-off, fighting each other at times, and finally they made a peace treaty, sealing the treaty by the king of the south sending his daughter to the king of the north to be his wife. But she shall not retain the power of her authority, and neither he nor his authority shall stand, but she shall be given up, and those who were brought with her, or who brought her, and with him who begot her, for whom she brought forth, and with him who strengthened her in those times. And him who begot her can also be rendered, whom she brought forth, as in her child. So that happened. There was a short-lived marriage between Antiochus Theos and Bernice. Antiochus being the Seleucid kingdom in the north. He was the king. And Bernice, the daughter of Ptolemaic Philadelphus. Ptolemy Philadelphus was the king of the south. Antiochus Theos was king of the north. Bernice was the daughter of the king of the south, and they made a treaty through the marriage. Now, one of the commentaries, in this case it's Clark's commentary, Bernice, the daughter of Ptolemy Philadelphus, king of Egypt, was married to Antiochus Theos, king of Syria. These two sovereigns had a bloody war for some years, and they agreed to terminate it by the above marriage. So it was a way to end war, on condition that Antiochus would put away his wife Laodice and her children when she did. So he, in essence, divorced her and her whole family, the whole batch of kids they had had, and he married Bernice. And then Bernice, having brought immense fortune to her husband, the deal had to be sweetened with money. You know how wars end. So she brought a huge fortune to the king of the north by this marriage. It went well for a time, but later Antiochus recalled his former wife Laodice and her children, and she, fearing that he might recall Bernice, so Laodice was afraid that he would recall or reinvigorate his marriage with Bernice because of the treaty, she caused him to be poisoned. Well, she got to come back to her husband and make sure he didn't get unfaithful again. She poisoned him. You'll see that this is a common theme going through Daniel chapter 11. It reads just like world history because it is. So she poisoned him and had her, Bernice, had her murdered. And then she set her own son, Callinicus, on the throne. So now we have another king on the throne. He's the son of Antiochus Theos. His name was Callinicus. Okay, now we come to verse 7, because verse 6 has been fulfilled. 5 and 6. Verse 7, it says this, but from a branch of her roots shall one arise in his place, who shall come with an army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and deal with them and prevail. And in verse 8, and he shall also carry their gods captive to Egypt, and their princes and their precious articles of silver and gold, and he shall continue more years than the king of the north. So you can tell, well, that's a major major war that takes place, and the king of the south ends up being victorious and really pretty well sacks the king of the north's fortunes. And that's exactly what happened. Now, this happened a few decades later. It was 218 BC. Now, the marriage of Antiochus Theos and Bernice, before the secondary thing happened, was in 252 BC. Now we're down to 218 BC. Antiochus III recovers Seleucia, and that's part of the territory that Egypt had gotten from him. And he attempts to conquer Judea, but he is repelled in trying to take Judea by Ptolemaic Philopator. Clark's commentary says this: a branch from the same root from which she sprang. This was Ptolemy Euergetes, and her, Bernice's brother, who was to avenge his sister's death. He marched with a great army against Seleucus Callinicus. Remember, the ones in the north are the Seleucids. So the kings are called Seleucus and then whatever their name is. So Callinicus was the son of Bernice that we mentioned earlier. Not Bernice, but Laodice. Seleucus Callinicus took some of his best places, indeed all Asia, from Mount Taurus to India, and returned to Egypt with an immense fortune. So he conquered the king of the north, or the bulk of the king of the north's territory, and he marched all the way to Egypt, all the way to India, taking more of their territory and bringing back a great deal of booty. This is what the king of the south did at this time, and this is in the 218 in counting down into the 2 teens there. 1,000 talents of silver, precious vessels, images of their gods, 2,500 without Callinicus daring to offer him battle. In other words, he just overwhelmed Callinicus's armies. I can but touch on these historic facts, the commentator says, for fear of extending these notes to an immoderate length. In other words, it was a vast amount of treasure that the Egyptian Seleucid, he wasn't technically Egyptian, by the way, he was a Greek, but lived in Egypt, ruled Egypt. Egypt was his country. Antiochus III, he brought back a vast amount of wealth back down to the kingdom of the south. So now we jump back into the scripture in verse 9. Also the king of the north shall come to the kingdom of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land. Now we look at another commentary that has a summary here, and many of the older traditional commentaries, Adam Clark, Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown, that's where I'm going to quote from right now, they have the story. So you can go back and you can take one out and you can read the story that I'm going through tonight. In a sense, the Bible study is to whet your appetite to do something like that, but there's a greater point that we'll get to toward the end that explains this. Okay. So into Egypt they carried their gods. Ptolemy, on hearing of a sedition in Egypt, returned with 40,000 talents of silver, precious vessels, 2,400 images, including Egyptian idols, which Cambyses, who was one of the Persian emperors, had carried from Egypt into Persia. The idolatrous Egyptians were so gratified that they named him Euergetes, or benefactor. Remember, he was ruling Egyptians. But they were so happy to get their gods back. Isn't that amazing? They wanted their pagan idols. And for why? You know, they assumed that those were their gods and that they did things. Now we know that paganism is completely wrong and empty. They aren't gods at all. They're statues at best that somebody carved who can't do a thing. And we worship the true God. And he can do whatever needs to be done. Number one, he's guiding the events of all these empires at this time. And if he can guide, God guides the events of nations then, you know he's guiding nations now. We live in the end time, brethren. You know, sometimes people try to sort of tolerate where they are, or maybe not want to think that they're at the end of the age, but there are too many prophecies being fulfilled. Now, this is one of the purposes of this exercise, is to go through prophecies that we have documentedly fulfilled, one after the other, after the other, after the other, over hundreds of years. Boom, 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 boom. And you see that God's hand in all of that. The reason we see that is because he inspired Daniel hundreds of years before they started to be fulfilled to give this detailed prophecy. And it's so detailed and so accurate that in the late 1800s, there grew a group of skeptics that said that Daniel could not have lived when he lived. He had to live much later. He had to live during the time of the Greek Empire, toward the end of the Greeks, when the Romans were about to conquer, for him to know all these things, so he could write about them. They don't get the point. It's prophecy that became history. Daniel wasn't a historian writing down what happened. He was a prophet writing down what will happen. God's kingdom is coming. That will happen just as surely as this will happen. Or this happened right back in the day. All right, now where were we? We were in verse 9. King of the north shall come to the kingdom of the king of the south and then return to his own land, but he will return with vast wealth, meaning that he took a lot of it from the king of the north, and then he went and got it from other parts of their empire. And he will continue more years. So Ptolemy survived Seleucus 4 years, reigning in all 46 years. One great historian, Maurer, writes this: "Then he, for several years, shall desist from contending with the king of the north." In other words, he fought with the king of the north. It was an ongoing warfare, and he always won. That had to get tiring for the king of the north, whichever king it was, that was having to fight him. However, now we come to verse 10, all things come to an end. However, his sons shall stir up strife and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overwhelm and pass through, and then he shall return to his fortress and stir up strife. His sons. Now, Jameson, Fawcett, Brown, the JFB commentary, which has a good historical assessment of these things, said, "The two sons of the king of the north, Seleucus Callinicus, upon his death by fall from his horse, namely Seleucus Cyrenius," that's his brother, "and Antiochus the Great, shall come. And Caranus having died, Antiochus alone prosecuted the war against Ptolemy Philopator, until he recovered all the parts of Syria and that were subjugated by the king of the south." So he got back the core of his territory. Not all of it probably, but all of these parts of Syria that were taken away from him. "And they shall come and they shall pass through like an overwhelming torrent." And Antiochus penetrated to Dura, which is near Caesarea, where he gave Ptolemy a 4 months truce. Then they returned, he says they shall return, picking up phrases from the verse that we read. One shall come, then one they'll pass through, then they'll return. They'll renew the war at the expiration of the truth. That's in Daniel 11:13. "And even to his fortress, he will fight the king of the south right down to his primary border fortress, which was called Raphia, Raphia, Raphia. And he took that and had border incursions into Edom and Arabia, Petraea, that's another way they said it in those days. Here Antiochus was vanquished, finally conquered the king of the south. So then we come to verse 11. "And the king of the south shall be moved with rage." It's going to make the king or the next king angry. "And shall go out and fight with him, with the king of the north, who shall muster a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into the hand of his enemy," meaning the king of the south shall win. "And when he has taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up, and he will cast down tens of thousands, but he will not prevail." So the king of the south was Ptolemy Philopator, who succeeded his father Euergetes, and he shall come forth and fight him. He came forth to Raphia, his border territory, where he was met by Antiochus, the king of the north, right on the border of the king of the south, and when the terrible battle was fought between these two kings. "And then he, Antiochus, the king of the north, shall set forth a great multitude. He will set forth amounting an army of about 62,000 on foot, 6,000 cavalry, and 102 elephants. Elephants were pretty terrifying. I don't know how exactly powerful they were in a pitched battle in the ancient world, but they were terrifying. The way that you use them is you put a hoda. I think they call it, the Indians used to call it a hoda, but it's a platform that's like a giant saddle on top of the elephant, where you can have 4 or 5 archers firing down at the enemy. Problem is that anybody that knows anything about elephants, they can put in one arrow in one spot on the elephant, he's going to go down. But it was terrifying. The elephants would throw people around with their trunks and that kind of thing. So we had a significant number of elephants, 102 elephants. But yet the multitude was given into his hand and the hand of the king of the south. All that vast army of the king of the north, right on the border of the king of the south, and the king of the south with a smaller army won. And Ptolemy gained a complete victory. Raphia and the other neighborhood towns declared them the victor, and Antiochus was obliged to retreat with his scattered army back to Antioch, where he was to solicit a peace. Now that's recorded in a number of histories. One of them is in 3 Maccabees, third chapter of the first chapter of Maccabees the third, which is a part of the Jewish writings that aren't inspired scripture, but they're written, well, they're mostly history, but written rather like scripture. They aren't inspired, however. Verse 13, for the king of the north, now we come back, the king of the north will return. So he got beaten off the border, right off the very border of the king of the south, and he chased all the way home, but he's going to return. He will. It says in verse 13, the king of the north will return and muster a multitude greater than the former. He'll raise a larger army than he had. They must have had very prolific population to be able to generate the numbers of soldiers they lost. And shall certainly come at the end of some years with a great army and much equipment. So the fulfillment, the king of the north shall return after certain years. In about 14 years, Antiochus did return. Took a little while to build up, but he got it done. Philopator was now dead. He was the king of the south. And his son Ptolemy Epiphanes was then a minor. He was a young man. And he brought a much larger army and more riches than these he had collected on the eastern expedition. So the king of the south went. Now to verse 14. And in those times many shall rise up against the king of the south, also violent men of your people, and exalt themselves in fulfillment of one of the vision, but they shall fail. And the king of the north shall come with a siege mound and take a fortified city, and the forces of the south will not withstand them. And his choice troops shall have no strength to resist. That occurred in 198 BC. We're starting to count down further and further toward the time of Christ. 198 BC, Antiochus III takes Judea, hoping to gain Egypt by marriage of his daughter to Ptolemy Epiphanes. But in verse 16, we go back to the biblical record. But he who comes against him shall do according to his will, and no one shall stand against him. He shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his power. So many will stand against the king of the south, Philip, the king of Macedon, and the rebels of Egypt combined with Antiochus against Ptolemy. So many stand against the king of the south. So the Seleucid emperor gathered up armies even from among the Jews to a degree. And then he makes a reference to the robbers of the robbers of his people. That is, factious men of the Jews shall exalt themselves to revolt against Ptolemy and join themselves to Antiochus. The Jews helped Antiochus' army with provisions on his return from Egypt when he besieged the Egyptian garrison left in Jerusalem. See, as I said, Judea was like a tennis ball going back and forth between the two emperors, the king of the south and the king of the north. And he shall set his face to enter the strength of his whole kingdom, and the upright ones with him. This is verse 17. He shall set his face to enter the strength of his whole kingdom, and the upright ones with him. And thus he shall do, and he shall give him the daughter of women to destroy it, but she shall not stand with him or before him. So, setting his face. Let's go to that part, or first line. That means to purpose steadfastly. You know, I set my face to go to Kmart. Didn't work. Kmart's closed. So you set your face to go somewhere else after that. So he set his face to go toward the king of the south. Antiochus' purpose was, however, turned from open assault to wile. In other words, he didn't come just to fight, but to intrigue, to trick, in other words. By his war with the Romans, in his endeavor to extend his kingdom to its limits, as it had been under Seleucus Nicator. Now the upright one is considered to be Jasher or Jehoshaphat. This is from Deuteronomy 35 and 32 and verse 15. Jasher is the epithet applied to the Hebrews, to their nations, being the upright ones. But they were called here in the upright as in the sense of robbers, of men of violence and factious. It's the general who would have been God's upright ones for confederating with godless heathen in the acts of violence that took place. By invading Ptolemy's country with his whole strength, he prepares his way, and so doing by following plan. This was the plan that the king of the north had. He gives to the king of the south, Ptolemy Epiphanes, his daughter Cleopatra. It's not the Cleopatra you think of, but a predecessor. His daughter Cleopatra in marriage, promising Assyrian and Judea as a dowry, part of Syria and Judea as a dowry, thus securing neutrality in the war with Rome. So they've got Rome as now a rising power, and they're starting to mess around with the Greek empires here. Through his daughter, he hoped his daughter to obtain Syria, Cilicia, and Lycia, and even Egypt itself at last, but Cleopatra favored her husband rather than her king of the north father. So defeated the scheme. She shall not stand on his side. So this Cleopatra was married off by her father to the king of the south, and her father was the king of the north, hoping that she would then be able to turn that kingdom over to him de facto, so he could name the leaders. But she didn't. She went in league with her husband, and the king of the south didn't get taken by the king of the north in that instance. Just exactly as it happened is what Daniel prophesied. That's the way God worked it out, just exactly as he had inspired Daniel to say. Now, verse 18, and after this he shall turn his face to the coastlands, and shall take many, but a ruler shall bring the reproach against them to the end, and with the reproach removed he shall turn him back, and he shall turn his face toward the fortress of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found. This happened in about 189 to 190 BC. Antiochus III defeated by the Romans in an attempt to conquer the coast of Asia Minor. So he lost that battle, and thus he lost the battle to the south. In verse 20, there shall arise in his place one who imposes taxes on the glorious kingdom, but within a few days he'll be destroyed, and not by anger or in battle. Now this occurred in verse 22, or sorry, let me see, 200 something to 176 BC. I'm afraid I'll have part of the date out. But still, we're counting down. We have Seleucus IV, and Antiochus III is poisoned by Helidorus, a tax collector, a Jewish tax collector apparently, whom Seleucus had sent to oppress Judea. So the imposing of taxes brought about the poisoning of the king of the north. And in his place shall arise a vile person, to whom they shall not give honor of royalty, and he shall come in peaceably and seize the kingdom by intrigue. Now we come to the very famous one, in 176 BC, mentioned in verse 21, that prophecy in verse 21. That is Antiochus IV. Antiochus IV, also known as Epiphanes, or Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes, as we often say it in English. He came to power. That was ominous. Now, we go on in verse 22. With the force of a flood, we're going to talk more about Antiochus Epiphanes. The force of the flood, they shall be swept away from before him and be broken, and also the prince of the covenant. And after the league is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, for he shall come up and become strong with a small number of people. He shall enter peaceably even to the richest places of the province, and he shall do what his fathers have not done, nor his forefathers. He shall disperse among them the plunder, the spoil, the riches, and he shall devise his plans against the strongholds, but only for a time.
And they shall shall be overflown before him. Antiochus Epiphanes would invade Egypt with overwhelming forces, overrunning across all of his territory. Then the prince of the covenant, that would be the Ptolemaic prince, Ptolemy Philopater, the son of Cleopatra, who was Antiochus' sister, was joined in covenant with him. And Ptolemy's guardians, while he was a boy, sought to recover from Epiphanes, Syria, part of southern Syria, and Palestine, which had been promised by Antiochus the Great as Cleopatra's dowry in marrying this Ptolemaic king. Hence arose the war over not getting what he wanted. Philopater's generals were vanquished, and Pelusium, the key of Egypt, was taken by Antiochus in 171 BC. Then he shall stir his power and courage against the king of the south. This is verse 25 of Daniel 11. He shall stir up his power and courage against the king of the south, and with a great army the king of the south shall be stirred up into battle with a very great and mighty army. But he shall not stand, for they shall devise plans against him. So, that's verse 25. This is still in 171 BC. And it goes on to say, yes, those, in verse 26, those who eat a portion of his delicacies shall destroy him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall slain. Both these kings' hearts shall be bent on evil, and they will speak lies at the same table, but it shall not prosper, for the end will still be at the appointed time. When returning to this land with great riches, his heart shall be moved against the holy covenant, and he shall do damage and return to his own land. Now, there's a really detailed fulfillment where it said, it spoke about things being discussed, speak lies at the same table. And that I'd need a half hour to set that up and explain that in detail. But it happened. There were the ruling members of the king of the north and ruling members of the king of the south at a banquet in the territory of the king of the south. That was very telling and turning point of events for them. But afterwards, Antiochus Epiphanes would come back up through the against the holy covenant. He would come back up to the promised land, and then he would do a lot of bad things there. This is what happens. So this is 171. Now we move forward just several years. 168 BC, Antiochus IV massacres Jews in Jerusalem. He moves against the Holy Covenant in that sense. On his way back to Syria from the meeting down in Egypt, he attacks Jerusalem. He slew 80,000, and he took 40,000 prisoners, and he sold 40,000 as slaves. So he killed 80,000, took 40,000 prisoners, and sold 40,000 slaves. So presumably the prisoners were in addition to the 40,000 slaves. That's a devastating attack on the Jews. And at the appointed time he'll return and go to the south, and it shall be like the former or the latter. Ships of Cyprus shall come against him, therefore he shall be grieved and return in rage against the Holy Covenant and do damage. So he, again, in 168, he goes down to attack the king of the south. But Cyprus by that time, it is a major island that's off the coast of Syria and Turkey, sort of up in the corner there of the Mediterranean. It was controlled by Rome, and their navies were based out of there at the time. They intervened on behalf of the king of the south in Egypt because they were setting themselves up as the guardians of Egypt. They would eventually take Egypt from him as well, but they blocked Antiochus Epiphanes in his attack. So he couldn't, because of the ships of Cyprus will come against him, he'll be grieved, and then it makes him angry, so he goes back. And also in 168, Antiochus is defeated by the Romans, and he starts back. But in verse 30, he shall return to show regard for those who forsake the Holy Covenant. He will regard those who forsake the Holy Covenant. The Holy Covenant is God's word. And the forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress, and they shall take away the daily sacrifices, and place there the abomination of desolation. Daniel was writing this hundreds of years before it happened in this detail. In 167, he's going back to his homeland in northern Syria. Antiochus Epiphanes is. He desecrates the temple in Jerusalem, He abolishes daily sacrifice. He sets up the abomination of desolation. That had to do with offering swine on the altar of burnt offerings, setting up statues of Zeus in the temple, and in every other way desecrating it and stopping the daily offerings so that they couldn't do that. And lots of other things where he intervened with what the Jewish people were holding as the truth, because at that time they were what was left of Israel it was. Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown gives a summary of this. He shall effect his purpose. Guided by Menelaus, the high priest, he enters the sanctuary with blasphemies, took away the gold and silver vessels, sacrificed swine on the altar, and sprinkled the broth of the flesh throughout the temple. Now, complete insult to the God of Israel and to the people of Israel. In verse 32, those who do wickedly against the covenant shall corrupt with flattery, but the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. So there's going to be a reaction. Daniel foretold the reaction. Some of the Jews stood for the truth. Some of them gave in, and they adopted the Greek way of living and corrupted themselves and worshiped the pagan gods. You know, Israelites are good at turning pagan, aren't they? But Judas Maccabeus and his father Matthias, who was a priest, or he and his brothers were priests as well, they began a powerful resistance movement against the Seleucid Greeks. Judas, being the dynamic leader, started by his father, he picked it up and carried it on. They began to attack the forces of the king of the north where they could, weakening his hold on the promised land. And they hammered away until they ended up with some independence, which is an appropriate name because Maccabee is a Hebrew word essentially meaning a type of hammer. And Judas was the hammer. He kept beating on the Greek authorities to free up the people of Judah. And then we come down, as we draw this to a close here. It takes a long time to get through this kind of a detailed prophecy, and I think I'm going too fast for you to really, grasp it all. But I hope I whet your appetite and give you the overview of what's happening here so that you read about it yourself. You can find the sources. Even in the church, we have more detailed prophecies in our Bible reading program. If you can find that online, you can actually get to a more detailed explanation of this that you can read at a slower pace. If I can whet your appetite to do that, then you begin to really harvest the value of this phenomenal prophecy of Daniel 11. Verse 33, and those people who understand shall instruct many, yet for many days they shall fall by sword and famine, by captivity and plundering. Now when they fall, they shall be aided with a little help, but many shall join with them by intrigue, and some of those of understanding shall fall to refine them, to purify them, to make them white until the time of the end, because it shall be for the appointed time. Those who have understanding. Now we're pointing down to the time of the end. We're launching far forward from the battles of these two Greek armies, or Greek kingdoms, one in Egypt and one in Syria. One is the king of the north in Syria, the other is the king of the south in Egypt. We're jumping far forward into the end time of this age, down closer to our time, the time of the end. And those who have understanding today, that would be God's true church and its various organizations. And we shall be spiritually purified, or not, until the actual time of the end in this age. See, it applied to the Jews then, but it applies to us now. Now we come to verse 36. Then the king shall do according to his own will. Looking further forward now, as we merge from a prophecy of the ancient times to a prophecy of our modern times. The king shall do according to his own will, in verse 36. He shall exalt and magnify himself above every god and speak great blasphemies against the God of gods, the true God that is, and shall prosper until the wrath has been accomplished. For what has been determined shall be done. Now we're talking here not about one of the kings of the kings of the north. But we're talking about the ultimate king of the north, which is to be a resurrection of the Roman Empire. The Grecian empires gave way to the Rome. The Roman Empire has had various revivals or resurrections down through time. That's another Bible study for another time, to mark those and to see how, that part of prophecy fulfilled. But it talks ultimately down to the end time, where there will be that final one. He shall prosper till the wrath has been accomplished, for what has been determined shall be done. Verse 37, he shall neither regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God, but he exalt himself above them all. This is talking about the one we call the beast. In biblical prophecy, he's called the beast, or the beast power. But in their place he shall honor a God of fortresses. He worships power. Fortresses. Power over other people. What did the king of the north do back in those days? What did Antiochus Epiphanes do? He was the god of fortresses. He exerted his power over the kingdom of the south, and then he exerted his power over the Jews, and he exerted his power over anybody they could exert his power over, until there was somebody who was stronger that exerted power over him. So the god of fortresses is the god of power, and that's what this world worships, isn't it? Going on in verse 38, and a God which his fathers did not know he shall honor with gold and silver and precious stones and pleasant things, and he shall act against the strongest fortresses with a foreign God, which he shall acknowledge and advance in glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many and divide the quest for many. So this was to be the final end of the king of the south, who would give way to the Roman Empire, and that would be the way of the Roman Empire throughout its very long history, marching on down ultimately to the various revivals of the Roman Empire. Again, another time we'll get into those. Now we look at the conquest of the king of the north in the end time, because we shift from very dramatically from the history to the prophecy of our day. It's hidden. The prophecies up to now in Daniel 11 are history to us because they were fulfilled long ago. They're one of the greatest proofs of the inspiration of God's word, because they're very detailed prophecies that were fulfilled in every detail when you go back and read the histories. And it isn't us only who say that. Almost any traditional conservative thinking commentator does the same thing. They say it over and over again. And you think, well, is anybody saying it today? Very few, because we don't live in an age where there were clear-thinking people. There were 50, 80, 100 years ago, there were some. Up to about many of the commentaries that we read were written in the late 1800s into the early 1900s. They recognized this. They had the history. They had the prophecy. They could understand that. Now, they couldn't understand the rest of God's way, but they did understand this. So, at the end, time of the end, verse 40, the king of the south shall attack him. Attack who? Well, who did the king of the south normally attack? The king of the north. See, the whole context is king of the south, king of the north. But now we're at the time of the end, so there's a new king of the south. Attacks this new king of the north. And shall come against him and the king of the north gets attacked, and then he charges, just like the king of the north did under Antiochus Epiphanes, charges down against the king of the south. Comes against him like a whirlwind with chariots and horsemen and many ships, and he shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. He'll go through them like a knife through butter. Through warm butter, too. In verse 40, there was a fulfillment of this when King Menelik of Ethiopia attacked the Italian Eritrea, defeating the Italians, and 40 years later, 1935, Mussolini retaliated by invading Ethiopia. They were remnants of the king of the south than the king of the north. Hitler became more the king of the north, ultimately. And then it says, this king of the north shall enter into the glorious land. That's the promised land, and be the state of Israel today. And many countries shall be overthrown, wherever they are, whether it's the Middle East, Europe, North America, South America. But these shall escape from his hand, especially this onslaught to the south. Edom, that's basically a part of the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan today, and Moab, Edom and Moab comprise the bulk of the nation of Jordan. For some reason, they escape. And the prominent people of Ammon, also a part of the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan today. That's a puzzle, but why has that occurred? Or why will that occur? don't necessarily know, but it will be really clear when it happens. In verse 42, he shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. Well, that would seem that Egypt in some way was the target. It didn't escape because he had targeted that place specifically, and he overran Egypt. And he shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver and the precious things of Egypt. Also the Libyans and the Ethiopians will follow at his heels. Now, Egypt is bordered by Libya, and at times in the ancient world, Libya and Egypt were one country. Ethiopia is south, and Egypt extended very far south into Africa, probably right into Ethiopia at times, what we call Ethiopia today. So you're getting that corner of Africa, but a great deal of that has been taken over. You don't have the Coptic Egyptians in very much population today. Mostly it's Arabs because of the great empires of the Arabs to come, in the 600s. And he shall power over the gold and silver and precious things of Egypt, and also the Libyans and the Ethiopians follow at his heels. Then comes news from the east and the north, and that shall trouble him. Therefore he will go out with a great fury to destroy and annihilate many. So there's some invasion from the north and from the east. Russia's in the north, the Orient is in the east, so you're getting geographical directions. And then we try to discern that with other prophecies to get as clear a picture as we can of these events, but this is a reasonably clear picture. The king of the north at the end of this age is the resurrection of the Roman Empire. Where is that based? Europe, Central Europe especially. And it comes rushing down. We saw that happen with Hitler. He came rushing down, but he got stopped in Egypt. He couldn't get to the promised land. And that was when Mr. Armstrong knew that, okay, this isn't the time. It's going to be another time. And he shall plant, the king of the south or north, shall plant his tents in the palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. All right, the palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. The glorious holy mountain's in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is between the Mediterranean Sea and the Dead Sea. Look on a map. It's right in between the two of them. Yet he shall come to his end, and no one will help him. Ultimately, the king of the north, in the end of the age, like the king of the north back in the day, earlier in the chapter, will come to their end. They came to their end. The king of the north will come to his end. And how will he come to his end? He'll come to his end with the return of Christ, who will put down all the armies who will amass against him. King of the north, very specifically. So essentially what we're looking at here is the resurrections of the Roman Greco Empire, because the Greeks precluded the Romans, or preceded the Romans. Hence the beast sets up his capital in Jerusalem. And ultimately, this is the time when Christ will return. Now, can we predict when it'll happen? Can you predict when Christ will return? And the answer is no man knows the day or the hour. So we can't know. But we can know the season. We can know generally. And we look at the markers of these prophecies and realize we live in auspicious times, in historic times. Just like I've got a little map here that is out of one of our booklets, our heritage booklets of old, which shows the Roman world and the Greek world and the Middle East and part of Africa. It shows where that action will all take place. It also shows in this particular one various ones of these kings of the north and kings of the south and the various verses out of Daniel 11. That will be the vortex of world history at that time when Christ returns, because he's coming to the Mount of Olives, and that's across the ravine from where the Temple Mount is. And we know about this ahead of time, brethren. We need to be thinking seriously and praying for the return of Christ, praying for, overcoming and growth, protection and guidance in the time that is between us and the actual time of the end. I hope you found this to be an interesting prophecy study tonight, a Bible study. And we'll look forward in a couple of weeks for having our next one. and we'll send out an announcement about the topic so you can be ready for that when it comes. In the meantime, we wish you all a happy Sabbath, and keep studying God's Word.